Try this again.
Just don't touch it.
Yeah, I'm not gonna move it.
Do I have to stay here?
No, I think I moved it. I just moved it the screen closer to me. All right. Thank you for just sticking with us for the technical difficulties. I'm Nick Escobedo. Like he mentioned, I'm one of the co-organizers with the PHP group. I'm happy to have you guys here. It's nice to see some new faces. We're going to be talking about, let's see, can you see the laser? No? Perfect. We're going to be talking about managing dependencies in PHP, and what I mean by that is like how our classes depend on each other. So we're going to talk about relationship goals. And kind of how, like, what's healthy, what's not healthy when we're talking about how classes depend on each other. So this is what we're going to go over. We're going to go over how to identify dependencies. So we're going to start like real basic, how to identify what your classes are using and what they're depending on. We're going to talk about, like I said, managing those. So whether or not it's okay or not okay for those to depend on each other. We're going to talk about how we can use interfaces to kind of break apart those relationships. So like you got a crazy ex, like you want to put an interface in between them. We're going to talk about dependency injection. We're just going to briefly touch on how we can use that, like that tool. And all these are just tools. So like when I say interfaces, dependency injection, these are just like tools that we can use to kind of either keep things together or kind of separate things where they should be. And lastly, we're going to talk about inversion of control container and IOC container. And again, it's another tool that we can use to either separate things or bring them together. So first things first, we're going to talk about what is a dependency. You didn't have your presenter notes up, so I forgot to enable that. So what is a dependency? It's essentially when one class depends on another class in order to get what it needs done. So yeah, I guess I wrote the definition here, but like I said, we've got one class that's got some code, and then inside that code maybe we've got new class, we're instantiating a new object. That's a dependency. So we're gonna start taking a look at some code, and the code that we're going to talk about is two-factor. So if you can imagine two-factor, some kind of might send a text message. In order to send a text message, we're going to need a third-party dependency, whether it's Twilio, Nexmo, or whatever. I'm picking on Twilio today. I don't work for them. I have no affiliation with them. This was actually just like a real-life example that I pulled from a code base that I was working on in order to kind of separate things in a healthy way. So let's take a look at some code. Are you able to see it? Is it big enough? All right. So we've got a class. It's called two-factor, and then that has a function called sendCode, and it takes in a phone number. There's quite a bit wrong here. It's a short piece of code, maybe, I don't know, 20 lines, but there's a bunch of things here that kind of couple us, that like bring us together and make us depend on Twilio. So you see where it says new Twilio? So it says new Twilio, and then it's got API key. That is a dependency. So two-factor is depending on Twilio in order to get its work done. And I'm going to make a case for why that is not what we want in this particular case. Okay. I thought the screen went off. I was like, yeah. So we're going to talk about like is depending on Twilio like what we really want, and it's not what we want. And let's say what happens if we decide to use a different provider. Let's say Nexmo. I mean, I don't know the other providers, but there's quite a bit of other providers. And this one is the one that I actually solved, and that is what if we only want to send text messages in production? That could be a big one, right? Like you're testing on your local machine and you happen to send text messages to people that you don't want to send text messages to. Especially if you're using fake data and that fake data is randomly generated and those phone numbers are real. Yeah, so that'd be pretty bad. So, and along the way, I'm going to have these things at the bottom where we say two factors depending on Twilio to get its work done. And it's kind of just to help us, an easier way to help represent that Twilio or two-factor depends on Twilio. So here's some code that we might see if we only wanted to do an if check and check to see whether or not we're going to send a message in production. The problem with this, again, is what if we were sending notifications via text message? We might also be doing that if check in that place. And then any other place we're sending a text message, we might also be doing this if check. It could really add a substantial amount of code to our code base, which isn't really needed if we've got like a central place that we're managing our text messages. What about if we wanted to change the provider based on the country that they're from? So let's say Twilio or Nexmo or whatever, they don't handle a place in Brazil, and maybe there's a cheaper provider in Brazil. We might want to use that provider. Again, you wouldn't want to do that in every place that you're sending a text message. That would just add quite a bit of code. So has anyone actually ever sent text messages or emails like for real on accident, like in their development environment? Yeah, it's not good. Yeah, I remember there was 1 or 2 times where we just sent like mass. It wasn't me; it was another developer, but it was like a mass email was sent out in a CRM, and it might have had production data on it too. Yeah, and then you have to explain like, hey, like that wasn't real. Yeah, we don't want to do that. So all this code is going to help us kind of avoid that as well. What if we wanted to test this? We can't really test this. Well, I'm sure there's a way to test it. I'm just not going to try and figure it out. Because every time we try and test this, it's doing this new Twilio. So every time we try and run the test, it's going to run that code and it's going to send a text message. And if the number that you're using in your test is real, it's going to go out. And all this, so when we start talking about getting into a more manageable state, we're going to talk about how we can use the interface, dependency injection, and an IOC container. So we've got 2-factor still depending on Twilio, even though we've added the if check. This is what a test might look like if we were going to test it. Again, so what we're doing is we're doing new 2-factor, and then we're calling the send code on 2-factor. We're passing in the number as a string, and then production as the thing, and then we're asserting true that it was actually sent. Again, like I said, this would actually send a text message because we are using Twilio directly in that class, which is a big problem. So let's talk about how we can break this stuff up using an interface. First, let's talk about interfaces. Is anybody in here like familiar with interfaces or use them like regularly or semi? Yeah. When I'm referring to interface, and if this doesn't trigger you, I don't know what will. This is not the type of interface we're talking about. This is our good old friend from Microsoft Office, Clippy. That's not what I'm talking about. Interface. First, before we get into code, I'm going to break it down, and we're going to use like a real world example. I think this illustrates what an interface is like in the physical sense. What we have here is it's got three holes. We can either choose to use the 3 holes, or we can use the 2 holes. That third one is optional, which we can do interfaces. But basically, what it does is it puts us an abstraction layer between us and, let's say, our gadgets. You know, we plug this into the wall. We don't have to unwire and wire our gadgets every time. We've got an agreed upon standard interface, which is those 3 prongs that allow us to use that. And it's safe to assume that if we've got the 2 prongs or the 3 prongs, that it's going to work. So we're safely relying on that thing behind the 3 holes is going to do its job. And we're gonna talk about how we can do something similar. So Wikipedia defines an interface in computing as in computing, an interface is a shared boundary which 2 or more separate components of a computer system exchange information. And so we're going to talk about kind of what an interface looks like and kind of what it does for us. And so when we talk about an interface, it defines the methods. So when you implement it on a class, it defines the methods that must exist on that class. It defines the inputs, and I put an asterisk there because so when you define the function, you don't necessarily have to you don't have to have inputs. It could be a function that doesn't have any parameters. So I'll back it up. If you are going to use parameters, I would suggest type hinting. And I also have define outputs. Again, this is not mandatory, but if it is going to return something, you can define the output, and you can define the output as a return type, so you can define it as a class, an interface, or whatever. I highly recommend, if you are going to define an output, to type hint that output. That functionality was just recently, well, I don't remember when PHP 7 was released, maybe a couple of years ago. That was introduced, the type hinting was introduced in PHP 7. So lastly, it creates a boundary between a higher level and a lower level class. And what I mean by that is, if we go back to our outlet, our socket example, that socket is our abstraction layer between us and the electricity. And so that's what our software interface is going to do for us. So let's talk about why we might want to use an interface. And so, and these are mostly my opinion, and these are not necessarily an exhaustive list, but it's self-documenting and it shows intent. And when I say self-documenting, you'll see when we start defining the methods that must exist on a class, you're kind of defining what that interface means to your application, and you're also showing the intent. Now, that doesn't mean you shouldn't put a doc block or some sort of documentation on your function, but it's when we start talking about defining those, it's going to be really helpful for other people who are going in to look at that stuff. So I put less bugs with an asterisk, because it doesn't necessarily mean that there will be less bugs, but when you start programming in this way, in my opinion, starts to promote like healthier programming habits and standardization of kind of the code that you're working with. So when we start talking about text messages and we're defining an interface for a text message, that'll be a standard way for us to send a text message. And lastly, not lastly, but so we've got IDEs. If you define an interface in your IDE, you go to create a class and then implement that interface, your IDE can auto stub your methods and make sure that you're putting the stuff that you need in the class in order for the PHP to not scream at you and make it freak out and blow up. And lastly, it helps manage our dependencies. It creates, like I said, it creates that boundary between the higher level and the lower level class. So this is the code that we had before. We've got the if check for the production. We've got the try catch, and it's returning whether or not it was successfully sent. So let's talk about how we might go about solving this with an actual interface. So we need to define the interface. And the interface looks similar to defining a class, but instead we've got interface instead of class. The other thing to note is we don't actually have like the body of the function. It is just the definition of the function. We give it a name, we give it the parameters that we want, and so this one right here, which is probably not very common for most people, this is the return type that I was saying. So we're saying that when we have this here, that this function will always return a Boolean, which is very important when we get to it, because other things that are using this interface are going to expect that to come back. And so we can rely on that value to always come back. I've defined the phone number as a string. Please, 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 if you're going to use phone numbers, define them as strings. Don't use numbers. You'll get some super weird stuff. If you get like phone numbers that start with zeros and other things, the languages can interpret them as not numbers. And so you treat them as strings. We've got the message. Again, so this interface is going to be generic. This isn't for simply sending a two-factor message. This is just, in general, sending a text message in our application. And this is what I was talking about, self-documenting and showing intent. Our intent is to send a text message, and that's the only job for this particular interface.
Nick, is the bool, is the return statement, is that specific to interfaces?
No. Say that again?
The way that's just the syntax, just the way that's with the colon.
Syntax is PHP, yes.
It's just it's
Yeah.
specifically PHP.
Right. Well, to my knowledge, I mean, like Java and other places, they don't use the colon. I think you just put it at the end.
But you can use that on a class method as well as an interface.
Yep.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, you're saying like the actual implementation of this? Is that what you're saying?
Just the return. I basically just.
He's asked about return.
I just haven't seen
they're
it.
new.
That's just returning a boolean. I just haven't seen it without a return.
So that's saying when we implement that send function that it has to return a boolean. If it doesn't, PHP is going to explode. And I'm putting that there intentionally so that we don't start returning things like a 0 or a 1, and then sometimes true and then sometimes false. Like I'm guaranteeing here that it's going to be true or false, so that let's say all of us are on a team and you guys go to use the interface, you know exactly what's going to happen without actually digging into it. You know you're going to get true or false, not an array with a message or something crazy like that. And you bring up a good point. If anybody has questions at all, stop me. It's no big deal. I'm happy to talk about any one of these slides now and also after as well. So feel free to stop me. You won't hurt my feelings. They're really hard to hurt. All right, so I'm glad you brought that up because we're going to actually start talking about creating that implementation. So we've defined the interface. We're going to create the code that actually implements that interface. So this is the code that we had before, so I'm keeping this here just so that we can make sure that what we had here. The biggest takeaway here is going to be the try and the catch. That's like the meat and potatoes of this. That's what for sending a message, and so that's what we're going to grab. Do we think that the send code function should actually know how to send a text message? I would say no. It doesn't need to. It doesn't need to know how to send a text message or who we're using. It doesn't need to know that we're using Twilio. It's actually bad that it knows that we're using Twilio because now we're bound to a specific provider. We don't want that. We want to guard our application because this is our business logic. We want to guard that from our third-party services. So let's take a look at what that looks like. All right, so this is what we call like a concrete implementation, a concretion implementation, whatever you want to call it. But this is going to be our first implementation, and we're going to call it. We're defining a new class, and this class is called Twilio Text Message. And you notice where it says implements text message in the top right. It's in purple. Can you read that? That's the part where we're saying that we're using the interface that we just defined, where it said send, phone number, message, and bool. And you can see that same, because you guys can't see, yeah, this doesn't. You can see where it says send, and that whole function definition is the exact same as what we had in our interface. That's the important part. That's the part that we're going to rely on once we call this back in the two-factor. And you'll notice that we grabbed the try catch and the response message sent successfully, and we put that in here because that's literally all this thing will do. And the try catch is very important because let's say this Twilio client send SMS throws an exception. To your point, we don't want to return that exception. We want to catch that, and we would just want to return false. Something wrong happened, and this is really short, like for demonstration purposes. We might want to bubble something up, like grab the error from Twilio and then bubble that up to the user so that they know, like, hey, the number that you gave us is like it's a Portuguese number or something. Like, what are you doing? But for our sake, for demonstration purposes, we're catching that to always return true or false. And this function here has defined, that's a Twilio function that's just made up in that Twilio class that is returning a true or false. It's just telling us whether or not the message sent successfully. The most important part here is that we've got the same function definition, the send, phone number, message, bool, and then we're returning, and then all the stuff that's happening in the middle is specific to Twilio. This interface is generic. Like we're passing in the message. We're not telling it, hey, send the two-factor code. All it cares is that we sent in a message. So this class, Twilio text message, depends on Twilio, and this dependency is perfect. This is what we want. This implementation was built specifically for Twilio. The two-factor class was not built specifically for Twilio. It's built specifically for sending a two-factor notification to our friend that wants to join or log in to the app. So this is a good dependency. This is one that we want. This is intentional. So now that we've created that implementation, we can now use that class in the two-factor code. So you notice that try-catch stuff is gone. So we don't have to do the try-catch stuff in there because that's hidden behind the Twilio text message. We still have the if check for the environment, but we'll talk about how we can get rid of that later. The try-catch is happening in the lower level class. Like this is our higher level business class, but the lower level class is taking care of the details. And now two-factor doesn't really care about the try-catch or Twilio or whatever. I mean, it knows about Twilio still, and we're going to keep moving along so that we can get rid of the Twilio dependency because we're using the Twilio concrete implementation. So we're going to see if we can swap out the Twilio text message with something else, but we don't have that yet. So after we talk about this, so two-factor is now depending on the Twilio text message, which is still not what we want because, right, we're still depending on Twilio. This is better. So now we're using something that's got an interface, but it's still not in our final form. So we're going to implement the interface again. And so this time we're going to use a logger. And this is going to be solely for our development purposes. So that way, instead of sending text messages, we can just log them to the log. It's got the same function definition. You see it implements text message. It's got public function send, phone number. It's returning a Boolean. We can just always return true because, I mean, if you have trouble logging, then you have some other issues, probably permissions issues.
So what's the purpose of doing it again? Yeah.
The purpose again is that, so we have an implementation when we're developing locally. So we built our production implementation, which was the one that actually sends the text messages. This one is going to be when we're just at home on our computer lollygagging, putzing around, and we've got maybe real phone numbers, and we're messing around. It doesn't actually send a message to the phone number. It will simply log the text message to the log. Okay, so any other questions? All right, so we've got log text message depending on logger, and again, this is a good dependency. We've built this concrete implementation specifically for logging, and this is what we want. I mean, eventually we can never just like fully remove dependencies, right? Like eventually we've got to rely on something, and so this is where we want to rely on it. And I thought I'd put these two together so we can kind of compare and contrast the two. We've got the top one, which is actually sending text messages, and the bottom one that's actually cut off. But you can see that they're both implementing the same interface. They're both got the same function, but they're just doing, the body is actually just doing something differently. One is interacting with a third-party service, and the other one's just, hey, I'm going to log this to the log. And when we use either one of these, we know that we're going to get some guaranteed functionality because we've got the send function that's returning a Boolean.
Is the send function coming from the implementation?
Yes.
Okay.
So we've defined the send function in the text message interface. Okay. And so in that interface, anything that says, so it says class name, implements, then the interface. When you say implements the interface, anything that's defined in the interface must be defined in the class. So again, this is what we had before. It's depending on the Twilio text message. And eventually what we're going to do is we're going to swap it out. We're going to like hot swap it out with the logging when we're on our local machine. Yeah, it is. Okay, so two-factor is still depending on the Twilio text message. So our next tool that we're going to talk about using is dependency injection. And so when we say dependency injection, all we're saying is that, you know, when we did new Twilio or new, what was the other one? New text message, Twilio text message, we're going to move that from the body into the constructor. Now the constructor is one way of doing it. You can use setters and stuff like that, but I personally prefer the constructors, and so we're going to take a look at how we can use this code here and use dependency injection. So we've got this. We can't test it, and when we start to use dependency injection, our dependencies I think they're easily laid out. So instead of having like new, like let's say this function was 100 lines long, okay, I would not recommend that, but I've seen it all the time. You might have new on line 5, you might have new on line 50, and then another one on 80. Like, so then you've just got dependencies like all over. Whereas if you're putting them in the constructor, it's very clear that what your dependencies are. And if they're not in the constructor or you're not using dependency injection, you can't really swap them out, right? Like we've got new Twilio text message. We can't swap that out for something else. Like when we want to test this, we can't swap it out. When I showed the test earlier, it was going to send a text message every time we used it. So let's take a look at what this looks like with dependency injection. So the biggest thing here is that the Twilio text message is in where it says __ construct. The Twilio text message is type hinted. Let me know if I'm in the way, but so we've got this here, and then we've defined a variable, and then we've defined this variable up top. And so what we're saying is, when we define a new two-factor class, that we must pass in a Twilio text message object into it. And then what we're doing is we're assigning this private variable, so this variable equal to the one that we're passing in. Are there any questions on that? Because that can get kind of... No? Okay. Perfect. We're all experts. So since this follows an interface, eventually what we're going to do is we're going to swap out that Twilio text message, and we're just going to type in the interface on it. But for right now, since it's in there, so you see down here, we've got even less code in here now. We don't have to do new Twilio text message in here anymore because it's being passed in. So even when we got it in the constructor, we still have the same dependency. So two-factor is still depending on the Twilio text message. So let's talk about how we can use dependency injection for the actual Twilio text message class, right? Because we've got the new Twilio, and then we've got API key in there. So let's talk about how we can use dependency injection to get rid of that new. Essentially, what we're doing is removing the new Twilio keyword. Okay, I think we've seen that enough. Okay, so you can literally see like this is like one line now. Before we had new Twilio. Twilio is now passed in at the top in the constructor, and we're setting that equal to a variable that we can use. So it says this Twilio down here. So since we're using it up here, we can use it down here, and it's literally a one-liner. This means that we can pass in any type of Twilio object, and what I mean by that is if we want to test this, for example, if we wanted to test that false is returned when an exception is thrown, we can do that now, because what we can do is we can pass in a fake Twilio instance and to make sure that we're getting false back. The other thing to note is, remember we had the API key in the code. It said new Twilio, and it had the API key in there. First off, don't put your keys in your code. Don't commit them. I've seen it like on GitHub so many times where people commit their code with their private keys in there. I mean, private AWS keys, things like that. People could take that. They can create servers. They can run your bill up. I mean, so what you probably want to do is use some sort of environment variables, so that when you're developing locally, you've got your local environment variables. When you're on production, you've got your production environment variables. Yeah, that would be the best case for that. All right, this is what the test would look like. So remember, we're passing. So back up. All we need to do is pass in a Twilio object in the constructor, and this class is going to work. And so what we're going to do is, with this test, we're going to create a mock Twilio object. And this is just for demonstration. So what we're saying is that when we say we're creating a new mock object, and then we're saying when we call the send SMS function, we're going to throw an exception, because remember in our code, when we get an exception, we're going to return false. And that's important to us because we want to make sure like that our code or our code base is failing gracefully. Otherwise, if it just explodes and we don't know how to handle it, that could be a problem for the user goes away, and maybe we've lost business. So we've got the mock, we're passing it in, and then we're calling the send function on Twilio text message, and then we're asserting that it's false. But this is possible because we're able to pass in our dependencies in the constructor. So we're going to do the same thing with the logger implementation. Can anyone guess what we're going to do with the new logger?
Logger in the constructor.
You got it. So what we're doing again is we're going to take this class name and put it in the top in the constructor. And then we're able to use this logger info to send all of our messages. Or not to, this one's not sending messages. We built this specifically not to send messages. All right. So even though it's dependency injected, it's still depending on the same classes. It's much easier to read. If you or I are walking in there and you're looking at the constructor to figure out what the dependencies are or what it needs in order to operate, if you let's say you're going to create a test, you know what you need to do in order to test it just by looking at the constructor.
Nick,
No problem.
when you're injecting the dependency, where does the class get instantiated?
Yeah. So that's perfect. Yeah. No, that's perfect. We're going to talk about that with the IOC container. No, that's great. I'm glad you're thinking about that, because like eventually we have to have a place. Like we're getting rid of all these new keywords, right? Like they're just disappearing. Like they're just going into the abyss. We're gonna towards the end we're gonna get into the IOC container and how we can use that to resolve them automatically. So for things like the logger, so if we go back, like the logger, you notice how like new logger, that doesn't have any parameters. It doesn't need anything to run. And so when we start talking about the container, like it'll just resolve that automatically. It can just instantiate it by itself without doing anything special. So yeah, we'll get into that. I wish there was a way to skip slides. All right, so now we're going to talk about the dependency injection with the interface. And so we in the two-factor, we had the Twilio text message, but now we're going to put the text message interface. So you can type hint. It doesn't necessarily need to be a class. You can type hint and have the interface as a parameter type. And then the biggest thing here is this is simply relying on the interface, right? Because in our interface, remember we defined a send function, and that send function had two parameters, and it was returning a Boolean. So we've got the two parameters. We're defining the message and the phone number, and this is going to be a Boolean. This is kind of like the, I wouldn't say perfect. I guess there's nothing ever perfect, but our two-factor doesn't care what we're using anymore. It doesn't care. It doesn't care if you're logging it. It doesn't care if you're using a third-party service. It is just using whatever you pass into it, because whatever you pass into it is making the assumption that it has those functions available to it. Kind of like our outlet. Our outlet, we're saying like it says like if it has electricity, it's going to give it to us, and it's got the 3 holes and the 2 holes, so we can just use it, assume that it works. So now we're depending directly, like I said, we're depending directly on the interface. And that interface is something that we defined. This is a part of our code base. That Twilio wasn't a part of our code base. That was probably maybe a composer package or something else. But this is code that we've defined and is working for our app. So let's talk about the inversion control container. And when we start talking about the inversion control container, this I thought was a good example. You pack your lunch in the morning. You pack your lunch in the morning and you configure your sandwich however you want it, right? Like maybe you got some roast beef, maybe you got some like ham, maybe like cheese on it, like maybe even mustard if you're going crazy. But you put it in there, you make a nice little package, you put it in there, and you make it in the morning, and then come lunchtime, you go to take it out. It's configured for you, right? Like you just take it out, it's the same way you put it in. So we can do that same kind of thing with the IOC container. It also provides like a benefit of like what I told you before. If it doesn't need to be configured, it can just auto-configure it, and we'll look at some code. This is going to help our two-factor class depend on our interface, and then have our interface resolve automatically to one of our implementations based on our environment. All right, so this is how we can configure the container. So remember, the Twilio needed the API key in order to work, right? Like it's a third-party service, they're going to require some kind of key to work. And so what we're saying here is we're going to bind. So anytime we want to use the Twilio text message class, it's going to return us a new Twilio text message class with that API key instantiated. So when we type hinted the Twilio text message, it's going to return us this. We don't have to define that every time. So let's say our key changed. What would we have to do if we didn't have this? We'd have to go to all around those different places and then change it in all those different places. And then the big one here is the text message interface. And all it's doing is an if check to check whether or not the environment is production or not. And if it's production, give us the real Twilio text message class, and if it's not, give us the log. And again, this is the only place. So anytime we're type hinting the text message interface, I guess it depends on the IOC container that you're using. So for example, like with Laravel, and I mean there's others too, like PHP-DI. I think that's from Symfony. There's Pimple's from Symfony, I think. But there's a whole lot of PHP IOC containers. This is just one example using Laravel, but I thought it would kind of make more sense. This is the only place we have to do it. We don't have to do it in all those other places in our code base, and that way you don't run the risk of sending text messages from your local instance. All right, so this is what we had with the text. So when we have this here, a lot of IOC containers can just automatically resolve that and give us the one that we need. And in this class, like I said before, doesn't care which one we get, right? Because we've got the interface, we've implemented that interface, and we're guaranteed that send function is guaranteed to exist. So we can use it safely. So let's take a look at that same code, but now let's take a look at it kind of like a tree and kind of how it resolves. So we've got two-factor relying on the text message interface, and then we've got our two implementations. We've got Twilio text message and we've got log text message. So two-factor is pointing down to text message interface, and then we've got our implementations pointing at the text message interface. And then after this, so that line signifies that two-factor doesn't care. It could give two craps about what it gets, just that it gets an implementation. And this is the whole point, right? Because like two-factor, like I said before, shouldn't care that we're using Twilio, that we're using whatever other provider, whatever is going on behind the scenes, it shouldn't care. It honestly shouldn't care. And so now we can write a test. And all we're doing is we're mocking that interface, and we're saying that mock interface, when we receive the send function, it should just return true. And so we're just, where it says assert true, that's our actual test. And we're able to do this because we're passing in our, like I said before, we're passing in our dependencies. So this is like the first stage of kind of building, like if you wanted to test your stuff, like getting it like this. And that's it. Questions? No? All right. Thank you very much.